The New Republic outlines Hegseth's prediction that the military may have to mobilize against U.S. citizens in a civil war. That comes from his 2020 book, American Crusade. In it, Hegseth writes, America will decline and die. A national divorce will ensue.
Very patriotic.
Outnumbered freedom lovers will fight back. The military and police, both bastions of freedom-loving patriots, will be forced to make a choice. It will not be good. Yes, there will be some form of civil war.
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. We've got Chris Goldsmith back. He is our resident Nazi hunter. No exaggeration. The guy literally takes down Nazi cells that are more active than ever, and tied into this whole Christian nationalist movement, which might have its first Secretary of Defense if Pete Hegseth's nomination goes through. We just ran this clip about Pete Hegseth's book and some of the more alarming passages from it. I'm just going to read one of them, Chris, and would love your reaction. Pete writes, "See you on the battlefield together. With God's help, we will save America." I mean, this is alarming stuff from anybody, much less the person who may control our million-person military when you count all the civilians and the nukes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pete Hegseth is someone who has been daydreaming about civil war. He uses the euphemism in his book, the national breakup or the national divorce, right? That's the same language that Marjorie Taylor Greene uses, right? This coded language that is just so plain and obvious about referring to Americans killing other Americans is deeply disturbing. Now, it's one thing when you are, as Pete Hegseth has imagined himself, as the infidel, as the lone rebel, right? But when you become the Secretary of Defense and you have the idea that you are part of a minority that needs to violently defend yourself against the majority of Americans, that is profoundly dangerous. And I really hope that if he has Senate confirmation hearings at all, senators don't waste time talking about his tattoos, because what he has written in his book is so much more clear and dangerous.
It is almost a fetishization. And I found the passage where he talks about the guns. He writes, "Our present moment is much like the 11th century. Anybody who knows what he's talking about should be really alarmed by that. We're talking about crusades, right? We don't want to fight, but like our fellow Christians 1,000 years ago, we must arm yourself. Metaphorically, intellectually, physically, our fight is not with guns yet." That's him saying yet. That's not me saying yet. He says our fight is not with guns yet. And he's talking about fellow Americans.
Yeah. It is hard a lot of the time, I think, as someone who studies these right-wing ecosystems, to figure out where the line exists between the grift. So he's trying to sell books to Fox News viewers, right? Between the grift and the true belief in things like using violence against Americans. What Pete Hegseth is talking about here is religiously motivated violence, is politically motivated violence that he has a desire to incite. And now, as the potential next Secretary of Defense, he'll be in a position to do it, to provoke this. And the way that this could go down, right? Everything that we're talking about sounds like far away hypotheticals, but the way that this could truly go down is if he is Secretary of Defense, if Tom Homan is Secretary of Homeland Security, and Stephen Miller is the Deputy Secretary for Policy, and they're doing what they've promised to do of mass deportations. The only way that you can find immigrants who are undocumented is to screen everybody, right? The definition of undocumented means there's no paper trail. So that means taking the military and going house to house to house to hunt down undocumented Americans. And if these people think that that isn't going to incite violence, they're delusional. In fact, I do think that they're hoping that it incites violence.
Yeah, I think that is the failure of imagination that we often warn about. They may understand that completely, and that kind of confrontation is exactly what they want. If what Pete says in his book is to be believed, that kind of violence is what he's looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he uses the word inevitable. It's the same. It's the same language that neo-Nazis and the alt-right uses to describe their movement as inevitable, in the way that they believe that white nationalism, this white racism, is inevitable in a pluralistic society. Pete Hegseth believes that Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy, is inevitably going to spark violent conflict. And he is seeking levers of power from our democracy as it still stands today, so that he can use that to impose his will, his belief systems on every American.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break to say thank you for all the support. If you value what we do here, please consider joining our Patreon community. The holidays are almost upon us, and if you are still wondering what to get for that hard to shop for person in your life, consider a Patreon gift membership. Every dollar goes back into our work. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh to check it out. Back to the show. Let's talk about his belief system, because you've known him for years. You tangled with him a decade ago during the height of the Iraq War. We just had Paul Rieckhoff on, who crossed swords with Pete Hegseth as well, occasionally found common cause. They wrote an op-ed together a long time ago. So I'm talking to people who've known Pete for a very long time. And what I sometimes hear, and you see this playing out on Capitol Hill right now as he's making nice with some of these Republican senators who he'll need, is that he doesn't actually believe any of this stuff, that he is an opportunist, that he'll say what he has to say, as you pointed out, to sell books to Fox News viewers, or in the case of his private campaigning in Capitol Hill to get their confirmation votes. I'm not sure that makes me feel any better, that he's that much of a chameleon and that manipulative. But do you have a sense of who the real Pete Hegseth might be?
I think the real Pete Hegseth is someone who just really appreciates power. Like J.D. Vance and so many people who knew J.D. Vance so well, they use the word that you just did, chameleon. They describe these guys who, unfortunately, were our brothers in arms once upon a time, who will shift their entire worldview. They will shift their morals, their ethics, their belief systems in order to conform to a rising dominant power. And that in this era is Donald Trump and Trumpism, which is racism, authoritarianism. It is a desire to strip away rights of other Americans. So who's the real Pete Hegseth? The real Pete Hegseth is someone who follows the power wherever it goes.
And it doesn't make him any less dangerous, right? Even if the tattoos are tongue-in-cheek or whatever, or even if his more provocative statements like, we're not using the guns yet, in his book is a bid to make the New York Times bestseller list, that kind of ambition in pursuit of power should reassure us.
Yeah, I think that what makes him and J.D. Vance so dangerous is that they have a lot in common with Donald Trump, and that is that they have no core beliefs that they're ever going to hold on to. So it makes opposing them, anticipating their actions, extremely difficult. I mean, we can draw up scenarios. You and I have worked on scenario planning and wargaming together, right? And we have to be so imaginative. We have to think outside of the box because these people aren't tethered to anything. And what they are going to chase is targets of opportunity, wedges that they can use to drive between Americans, opportunities that they can exploit other Americans to create fear, an environment of fear, so that they can assert further controls and make people, because they're afraid, want to give up their freedoms in order to feel more security. These people have all of the hallmarks of the world's most infamous fascist leaders.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about with respect to Hegseth is his lack of qualifications. I think you're right to focus on his, not just his character flaws, but his menacing attitude towards American democracy and his fellow Americans. But we had Senator Duckworth on, and she made a pretty strong case that so far as the Senate and the confirmation hearings are concerned, the most salient argument for average Americans is going to be that this guy has never led an organization remotely close to the Department of Defense. The most people he's ever led was a platoon in Iraq, and God bless him for serving his country, right? We appreciate his service, but you cannot give someone with that lack of experience the Department of Defense.
I agree with you, and I agree with Senator Duckworth, but where I disagree with Senator Duckworth is that the vast majority of Americans are sympathetic to the message that you shouldn't put an unprepared person in a high office. We've seen them do it with Donald Trump several times, right? He lost 2020 by a narrow margin, right? There are 70 plus million Americans who are impervious to the idea that an unqualified person should not be in charge of the nukes. That's the fact, right? I don't think that argument is going to land well. In fact, I think that they are going to, the Joe Rogans of the world, right? The contrarians, the heterodox folks, they are going to say, well, all these people with the great pedigrees, they've been screwing it up for so long. So why don't we just give this guy a chance? That is the logic that has brought authoritarianism into our country, and it's not going to die. It is not going to die tomorrow. It's not going to die during the Senate hearings, where I think that, I hope that people like Senator Duckworth are spending their time is creating a record for historians. If our democracy is to survive this, we want to make sure that the questions being asked of him get to his lack of qualifications, but also document in the greatest detail possible the level of extremism of Hegseth and every other Trump nominee, because that record is going to be what future generations, if our democracy survives, and I think it will, that record is going to be what future generations depend on to become more resistant to the travesty that we are currently experiencing today.
Well, Kris, that is an ominous recommendation, because it suggests that we may just have to endure, at least for the next 4 years, hopefully no longer, people like Pete Hegseth and RFK Jr. and Stephen Miller, and leave it to our successors to help figure out the mess and fix it. Thank you, as always, for your insight. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Ken.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.